The great doors of the Voss court slammed open, and every lord in the room turned at once. A small boy broke free from his nurse's hand and ran across the marble floor, his bare feet slapping against the cold stone, his eyes fixed on one person only. He did not stop for the guards who reached out to catch him. He did not stop for the gasps that rose around him. He ran straight to a servant girl standing near the back wall, wrapped his arms around her legs, and shouted one word that would change everything. "Mama." The word rang through the throne room like a bell struck in a silent church. Every conversation died. Every goblet stopped halfway to every mouth. Even the fire in the great hearth seemed to hold its breath. At the head of the room, seated on a throne carved from black oak and iron, Alpha King Damien Voss rose slowly to his feet, his gaze locked on the servant girl who had just been named mother by his only son, in front of the entire court. No one in that hall breathed for what felt like a very long time. 3 days earlier, Elena Whitmore had been nothing more than a name on a kitchen roster. She rose before dawn each morning in the servants' quarters, a narrow room she shared with 2 other girls, and she was at her post in the palace kitchens before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills. She scrubbed pots until her knuckles ached. She carried trays up long staircases until her arms trembled. She kept her eyes down and her voice quiet, because in the palace of the Alpha King, servants who drew attention rarely kept their positions for long. Elena had worked in the palace for 8 months. In that time, she had learned the rhythms of the place, the way a sailor learns the moods of the sea. She knew which hallways to avoid when the king was in a foul temper. She knew which guards would look the other way if she was a few minutes late, and which ones would report her without a second thought. She knew that the west wing of the palace, where the nursery stood, was almost always silent, because the boy who lived there did not speak. Everyone in the palace had heard the story, though no one spoke of it openly. A year before Elena arrived, the king's wife, Queen Seraphina, had died in a fire that swept through the eastern guest house during a storm. The official account said it was an accident, a candle knocked over by the wind, a curtain that caught too quickly for anyone to stop it. But servants whispered when they thought no one was listening, and the whispers said the fire had not been an accident at all. Since that night, Prince Kai, barely 2 years old at the time, had not spoken a single word. Elena had seen him only from a distance, a small figure, trailing behind a rotating parade of nurses, who never lasted more than a few weeks. He was a beautiful child, with dark hair like his father, and eyes the color of storm clouds, but there was a stillness to him that unsettled everyone who looked too closely. He did not laugh, he did not cry, not the way other children cried. He simply existed, quiet and watchful, as though he was waiting for something the rest of the world could not see. On the morning everything changed, Elena had been carrying a stack of clean linens toward the laundry storage, when Mistress Halbrook, the head of the household staff, caught her by the sleeve in the hallway. "You," Mistress Halbrook said, looking Elena up and down, as though deciding whether she would do. "The nursery nurse fell ill this morning, and there is no one else free. You will mind the young prince until midday." Elena's stomach tightened. "Me? I have never worked with children, ma'am. I would not know what to do. You will stand in the room and make certain he does not wander into the fire or fall from a window. That is all that is required. The king is occupied with the delegation from the northern Pax and cannot be troubled with nursery matters today. Do not fail at this, girl." The last nurse who displeased the king's household was dismissed within the hour. There was no room for argument. Elena set down the linens and followed Mistress Halbrook up the west staircase, her heart beating faster with every step. She had heard enough about the palace to know that nothing involving the king's son was ever truly simple, and nothing that touched the royal family was ever without consequence. The nursery was a large room, with tall windows that let in soft morning light. Toys sat untouched on shelves, arranged with the careful precision of a room that was cleaned often but rarely used with any joy. In the center of the room, on a woven rug, sat Prince Kai, turning a small wooden horse over and over in his hands, without any real interest in the toy itself. He did not look up when Elena entered. "Hello," Elena said softly, kneeling a respectful distance away. "My name is Elena. I am going to stay with you for a little while." The boy said nothing. He did not even glance in her direction. Elena had been warned about this, but seeing it for herself was different. There was something deeply sad about a child so young, who had already learned to disappear inside himself. She did not press him. Instead, she settled onto the floor a few feet away and began to fold a small pile of blankets that had been left in a heap near the window, more to give her hands something to do than out of any real need. As she worked, she began to hum, quietly at first, an old lullaby her own mother used to sing to her when she was small, back before her life had changed in ways she still did not like to think about. She was not trying to reach the boy. She was only trying to fill the silence, to make the strange, still room feel a little less like a held breath. But partway through the second verse, she noticed the wooden horse had stopped turning in Kai's hands. She kept humming, careful not to look at him too directly, sensing somehow that a child so guarded would bolt from attention the way a frightened animal bolts from a hand reaching too fast. She finished the lullaby and began to fold another blanket. When she glanced up, Kai was watching her. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt enormous. His storm-gray eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that seemed far too old for a child his age. Elena smiled gently and continued folding, humming the tune again from the beginning, and this time, she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, as though some small, buried part of him wanted to smile back but had forgotten how. For the rest of the morning, Elena did not try to force conversation or coax him into playing. She simply stayed near him, humming when the silence grew too heavy, tidying the room, occasionally offering him a toy without expectation that he would take it. Slowly, so slowly she almost did not notice it happening, Kai began to inch closer to her across the rug. By the time the sun stood high overhead, he was sitting close enough that his small shoulder brushed against her arm. Elena did not know what to make of it. She had been told the boy had not responded to a single nurse in a full year, and yet here he was, leaning quietly against a servant girl he had met only hours before. She told herself it meant nothing, that children were simply drawn to warmth and gentle voices, and that she would return to the kitchens by evening, and never think of this strange, sad little prince again. She was wrong. When Mistress Halbrook returned near midday to collect her, she found the boy asleep with his head resting against Elena's arm, his small hand curled into the fabric of her sleeve, as though he feared she might vanish if he let go. Mistress Halbrook's eyebrows rose so high, they nearly vanished into her hairline. "Well," she said quietly, careful not to wake the child, "I have never seen the like." "He was quiet all morning," Elena whispered, easing her arm free, as gently as she could. "I did not do anything special, I only sat with him. Whatever you did, you will do it again tomorrow, and the day after." Mistress Halbrook's tone left no room for refusal. "I will speak with the housekeeper about reassigning you to the nursery until a new permanent nurse is found. Do not look so worried, girl. This is a good thing. For you, and perhaps for him." Elena was not so certain. She had spent 8 months learning to be invisible in this palace, and invisibility had kept her safe. The nursery, so close to the heart of the royal family, was the opposite of invisible. But she could hardly argue with Mistress Halbrook, and in truth, some quiet part of her did not want to. She thought of the way Kai's hand had curled into her sleeve, trusting her without a single word between them, and something in her chest ached in a way she had not felt in a very long time. The next morning, Elena returned to the nursery as instructed, and this time, Kai was awake and waiting for her by the door, as though he had somehow known she was coming. He did not run to her the way a normal child might. He simply stood very still, watching, until she knelt down to his level and offered a quiet good morning. Only then did he step forward and press himself against her shoulder, in something that was almost, but not quite, an embrace. That night, back in the servants' quarters, Elena lay awake on her narrow cot long after the candles had been snuffed out. Across the small room, her roommate Ruth, a laundry maid with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue for palace gossip, propped herself up on one elbow. "They say the little prince would not let go of you," Ruth whispered into the darkness. Mistress Halbrook told the housekeeper, and the housekeeper told everyone in the sewing room before supper. "You are the talk of the entire staff wing tonight, Elena Whitmore." "It was nothing," Elena murmured, though her heart still felt strange and unsettled. He was tired. Children fall asleep on whoever is nearby. Children do not fall asleep on whoever is nearby in this palace. Ruth's voice dropped lower, more serious now. "Not that child. Not since the fire. You should be careful, Elena. Attention in this place is not always a kindness." The king buried a wife under strange circumstances, and everyone who gets too close to that family seems to end up either very fortunate or very finished. There is rarely anything in between. Elena said nothing, staring up at the cracked plaster ceiling. She thought of the fire everyone spoke of in careful whispers, the storm that had supposedly knocked over a candle, the curtains that had caught far too quickly for an ordinary accident. She thought, too, of the strange, half-formed memories that sometimes surfaced in her own mind late at night. Memories of smoke and heat, and a woman's voice calling a name that was not quite her own. She had always told herself those memories belonged to a different fire, years earlier, the one that had taken her own parents when she was very small. She had never questioned it too closely. Questioning things too closely had never done her any good. "I only sat with him and hummed a song," Elena said finally. "That is all I did." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "Well, whatever you did, do not stop doing it. That boy has not made a sound in a year. If you are the one who brings him back, the whole palace will remember your name, for better or for worse." She lay back down, pulling her blanket up to her chin. "Just be careful which lords notice you doing it. Not everyone in this court wants to see that child healed." Elena turned the words over in her mind, long after Ruth's breathing had evened into sleep. She did not know what Ruth meant by lords who did not want the prince healed, and she told herself it was only servants' talk, the kind of dark rumor that grew in any household with too many idle hands and too many locked doors. But sleep did not come easily that night, and when it finally did, her dreams were full of fire and smoke and a voice she could almost, but not quite, remember. Days passed this way. Elena hummed her lullabies. She folded blankets and arranged toys, and spoke softly about nothing in particular, filling the silence with the sound of her voice, because she sensed, without quite understanding why, that the boy needed to hear a steady, gentle voice, more than he needed anything else. She never asked him to speak. She never made him feel as though his silence was a failure. And slowly, the palace began to notice. Guards stationed near the nursery mentioned, in passing, that the prince's room had grown quieter in a different way. Not the heavy silence of grief, but something closer to peace. Kitchen staff whispered that the new nursery girl had a gift with the boy that none of the trained nurses had managed. Even Mistress Halbrook, who prided herself on never showing surprise, found herself watching Elena with a curious, careful attention. Elena tried not to let any of it matter to her. She told herself, again and again, that she was only doing her duty, that the attention would fade once a proper nurse was found, that she would return to her linens and her scrubbed pots, and her invisible corner of palace life soon enough. But there were moments, quiet moments in the late afternoon light of the nursery, when Kai would fall asleep against her shoulder, his small chest rising and falling in an easy rhythm he had not managed in a full year, and Elena would feel something inside her shift in a way she could not name, and did not entirely trust. She had learned, long ago, that caring too much about anything in this world only made the losing of it hurt more. And yet here she was, humming lullabies to a king's son, letting herself hope for a child who was not hers, in a palace where nothing was ever simple, and no kindness ever went unnoticed for long. On the 6th day, everything changed. Elena had brought Kai a small bowl of berries for his midday meal, sitting cross-legged on the rug beside him as she always did, humming softly under her breath as she helped him hold the spoon steady in his small fingers. The window was open, letting in a warm breeze that smelled of the gardens below, and for a moment, the room felt almost like an ordinary room, and Kai felt almost like an ordinary boy. He looked up at her, his storm-gray eyes catching the light, and his lips parted. Elena kept humming, not expecting anything, the way she had learned not to expect anything from him. "Mama," Kai said. The spoon slipped from Elena's fingers and clattered against the bowl. For a moment, she was certain she had misheard him, that her own tired mind had conjured the word out of hope rather than reality. But Kai said it again, softer this time, almost like a question, as though he was testing whether the word was allowed. "Mama." Elena's throat closed. She did not know what to say, what she was permitted to say, what any of this meant for a servant girl and a king's motherless son. She only knew that the boy was looking at her with something that had been missing from his eyes since the day she met him, something that looked almost like hope, and she could not bring herself to correct him, not in that moment, not when his small hand was already reaching for hers. She did not yet know that a guard stationed just outside the nursery door had heard every word. By the time the sun began to set that evening, the story had already begun its journey through the palace, whispered from guard to servant to steward, growing a little with every telling, until it reached the one man in the entire kingdom, whose reaction would determine everything that came next. Alpha King Damien Voss was in his private study, reviewing reports from the northern border, when his personal guard, a stern man named Corwin, who rarely interrupted him for anything short of an emergency, knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "My lord," Corwin said, his voice unusually careful. "There is something you need to hear. It concerns the young prince." Damien's pen stopped moving. In the year since his wife's death, very little had been able to draw his full attention away from the endless demands of ruling a kingdom, still recovering from the loss of its queen. But any mention of Kai, any hint of change in the silent, grieving boy who had once been full of laughter, cut through everything else instantly. "Speak," Damien said, setting down his pen. Corwin told him what he had witnessed outside the nursery door. The servant girl, the spoon dropped in surprise, the words spoken not once but twice. He told him how the boy had reached for her hand without hesitation, how he had leaned into her as though she was something solid in a world that had felt unsteady for a very long time. Damien sat very still as he listened, his expression giving away nothing, though something old and painful stirred behind his eyes. "Her name," he said finally, his voice low. "Elena, my lord. Elena Whitmore. A kitchen servant, assigned to the nursery only 6 days ago, while a permanent nurse is found." Damien rose from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over the palace grounds toward the west wing, where the nursery windows were just visible in the fading light. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. He had not heard his son speak in over a year. He had watched physicians and healers, and even a pack elder known for working with grieving children come and go, each one unable to reach the small, silent boy who had once called his name 100 times a day. He had begun to fear, in the quiet hours of the night when fear was easiest to admit, that his son might never speak again, that the fire which took his mother had taken something from Kai as well, something that could not be replaced. And now a kitchen servant, a girl he had likely passed in the halls without ever noticing, had done in 6 days what an entire kingdom's worth of physicians had failed to do in a year. "Bring her to me," Damien said quietly. "Tomorrow, before the court gathers. I want to see this for myself." Corwin bowed and left the study, and Damien remained at the window a long while longer, watching the last light fade from the sky above the west wing, his mind caught between something dangerously close to hope and the old, familiar caution that had kept him alive and kept his kingdom standing through a year of grief and suspicion. He did not yet know that the servant girl waiting in the nursery carried secrets of her own, secrets that would, in time, tie her to his family in ways far deeper than anyone in that palace could have imagined. He only knew that his son had spoken a single word after a year of silence, and that the entire course of his household was about to change because of it. In the nursery, unaware that she had already been summoned before the king, Elena sat beside a sleeping Kai as the evening settled over the palace, her hand still held gently in his small fingers, her heart caught between fear and a fragile, unfamiliar warmth she did not know what to do with. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena allowed herself to hope. Elena woke before the dawn bell, as she always did, but this morning her stomach twisted with a nervous energy she could not shake. She dressed quickly in her plain gray uniform, tied her dark hair back with practiced hands, and made her way toward the kitchens, expecting an ordinary day of trays and linens before her afternoon in the nursery. She did not reach the kitchens. Corwin, the king's personal guard, was waiting for her at the bottom of the servants' staircase, his broad frame filling the narrow passage. Elena's steps faltered. Guards did not wait for kitchen maids unless something had gone very wrong. "Elena Whitmore," Corwin said, his tone giving nothing away. "You are to come with me. The king wishes to speak with you." The words landed like a stone in her chest. "Have I done something wrong? That is not for me to say. Walk with me, and do not keep him waiting." Elena's mind raced through every possible mistake as she followed Corwin through corridors she had never been permitted to enter, past tapestries depicting the old wars of the Voss pack, past guards who watched her with open curiosity as she passed. She thought of Ruth's warning from the night before, about lords who did not want the prince healed, about attention in this palace rarely landing softly. She thought, too, of Kai's small hand curled into her sleeve, and she found she could not regret whatever had happened, even if it cost her the only steady position she had ever held. They stopped outside a set of tall doors carved with the crest of the Voss pack, a wolf standing beneath a crown of iron thorns. Corwin knocked once and pushed the door open. "The girl, my lord." The king's private study was smaller than Elena had expected, though every inch of it spoke of power. Shelves lined with old books climbed to the ceiling. A large window looked out over the palace grounds, and behind a heavy oak desk stood Alpha King Damien Voss, taller and broader than she had imagined from the distance she had always kept from him, his dark eyes fixed on her, with an intensity that made her want to look at the floor and never look up again. She did not look away. Some old, stubborn instinct kept her chin level, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Elena Whitmore," Damien said, his voice low and even. "I am told my son called you Mama yesterday afternoon. Twice." There it was. The words hung in the air between them, and Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "My lord, I did not encourage it. I would never presume to." "I did not ask if you encouraged it." Damien stepped around the desk, studying her the way a man might study a puzzle missing several pieces. "I asked whether it happened." "Yes," Elena said quietly, "it happened." For a long moment, Damien said nothing at all. He walked a slow circle around her, not close enough to be threatening, but close enough that Elena felt every second of the silence pressing against her skin. She had heard the stories about the Alpha King, that he could smell a lie from across a room, that no servant had ever successfully deceived him and kept their position afterward. "My son has not spoken since his mother died," Damien said finally. "Not one word, in over a year. Physicians from 3 territories have examined him. Pack elders have tried every remedy known to our people. Nothing reached him. And then a kitchen servant sits with him for a single afternoon, and he speaks 2 words no one has heard him say since the fire. I only hummed to him, my lord. I folded blankets. I did not do anything a proper nurse would not have done. And yet none of the proper nurses managed it." Damien stopped in front of her, and Elena forced herself to hold his gaze, though every part of her wanted to look away. "Tell me something, Elena Whitmore. Why did he choose that word? Mama. Not your name. Not any word a child might say to comfort himself. That word, specifically." Elena's throat tightened. "I do not know, my lord. I have wondered the same thing myself." It was the truth, and something in her voice must have carried that truth clearly enough, because the hard line of Damien's jaw eased, just slightly. "I am going to ask something of you," he said. "You will continue as my son's caretaker, until a formal decision is made. You will be moved from the kitchen staff and given quarters closer to the nursery. Your duties, your wages, everything will change to reflect this new position. In exchange, I expect complete honesty from you at all times. If you cannot give me that, tell me now, and we will end this conversation before it begins." Elena's mind spun. This was not the punishment she had feared, but it was not entirely safety either. A position this close to the royal family would draw eyes from every corner of the court, and Ruth's warning echoed in her mind again, sharp and unwelcome. "I can give you honesty, my lord," Elena said. "I have never had reason to lie about anything that happens in that nursery." "Good." Damien returned to his desk, and something in his posture told her the audience was nearly finished. "One more thing, Elena. Look at me." She had been looking at him, but she lifted her chin further, meeting his eyes fully for the first time since entering the room. Whatever he was searching for in her face, she could not guess, but she saw something shift behind his own eyes. A flicker of confusion, almost recognition, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Nothing," he said finally, more to himself than to her. "You may go. Corwin will show you to your new quarters. Report to the nursery within the hour." Elena curtsied and turned to leave, her legs unsteady beneath her, relief and disbelief tangled together in her chest. She had walked into that study, certain she would walk out, dismissed from the palace entirely, and instead, she was walking out with a new position, closer to the royal family than any servant she knew. She did not see the look Damien gave her back as she left the room. a long, searching look that lingered far longer than the situation required. News of Elena's reassignment spread through the palace before the midday meal. In the kitchens, the cooks whispered that the king himself had summoned her. In the sewing rooms, the seamstresses debated whether she had bewitched the young prince or simply been fortunate enough to catch him on a good day. In the guards' hall, Corwin found himself answering more questions about the quiet kitchen girl than he had answered about anything in months. Not everyone in the palace received the news with curiosity alone. In a private chamber overlooking the eastern gardens, General Callan Rourke, commander of the king's personal guard, and one of the few men in the kingdom who had known Damien since they were both young pups training in the northern forests, listened to the report from one of his officers, with a stillness that unsettled the younger man delivering it. "A servant girl," Callan said slowly, once the officer had finished and been dismissed, "moved into quarters near the nursery, given the king's personal attention within a single day." He crossed to the window, looking out over the gardens where, a year and a half ago, Queen Seraphina had walked every morning before the fire took her. Callan had loved Seraphina like a sister, had sworn an oath to protect her and her son with his own life, and had failed in that oath in a way that still woke him some nights with his hands clenched into fists. He had not forgotten the whispers that circulated in the weeks after the fire, whispers that the flames had not been an accident at all, whispers that someone within the palace walls had wanted the queen gone, and had been willing to risk the young prince's life to achieve it. He had never found proof. He had never stopped looking. And now, a servant girl with no family, no history that anyone in the palace could account for, had appeared out of nowhere, and won the trust of both the king and the silent, grieving prince, within the span of a single week. Callan did not believe in coincidences. Not in this palace, not after everything that had already been lost. He made a quiet decision that afternoon, one he did not share with anyone, not even the king he had served faithfully for over a decade. He would watch Elena Whitmore. He would learn everything there was to know about where she had come from, and why she had appeared in this palace at exactly this moment. And if she posed even the smallest threat to the boy he had sworn to protect, he would deal with her himself, quietly, before anyone else in the court even noticed she was gone. Elena, unaware of the general's silent vigilance, spent that afternoon settling into her new quarters, a small but private room, far nicer than anything she had shared with Ruth, and reporting to the nursery exactly as instructed. Kai greeted her at the door the moment she arrived, his small face lighting with something close to relief, as though some part of him had feared she would not return. "I am here," Elena said softly, kneeling to meet his eyes. "I am not going anywhere." She did not know if that promise was hers to make. She only knew that in that moment, watching Kai's shoulders relax and his small hand slip into hers, she meant it with her whole heart, and she intended to keep it for as long as the palace, and the king, and whatever forces moved quietly behind its walls, would allow her to. Outside the nursery door, unnoticed by either of them, a shadow lingered a moment longer than necessary, before moving on down the corridor, carrying word of everything it had witnessed, to ears that had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this kind of opportunity. 2 weeks passed, and the change in Prince Kai became impossible for anyone in the palace to ignore. He spoke more each day, small sentences at first, halting and careful, as though he was relearning a language he had once known well. He asked for his toys by name. He pointed at birds outside the nursery window, and asked Elena what they were called. He laughed, quietly at first, then more freely, a sound so rare in that wing of the palace that servants passing in the hallway would slow their steps just to hear it. Elena found herself changing too, in ways she had not expected. She had spent years keeping herself small and unremarkable, moving through life the way a person moves through a room full of sleeping dogs, careful not to wake anything that might turn and bite. But in the nursery, with Kai's small hand so often in hers, she found it harder to hold herself at that careful distance. She began to let herself smile, without checking first whether smiling was safe. She began to hum louder, to laugh at Kai's small jokes, to feel something that almost resembled happiness, settling into her chest for the first time in longer than she cared to admit. She told herself it would not last. Good things in her life never had. Alpha King Damien Voss began visiting the nursery himself, something the staff whispered he had not done in months. He would arrive in the evenings, still in his formal coat from the day's business, and stand in the doorway for a moment before entering, as though bracing himself for what he might find. Each time, he found the same thing: his son, animated and speaking, sitting close beside a servant girl who seemed entirely unaware of how remarkable the scene truly was. "He asked me today why the sky turns orange in the evening," Damien said one night, standing near the window while Elena tucked a sleepy Kai into his bed. "He has not asked me a single question in over a year. Do you understand what that means to me?" Elena smoothed the blanket over Kai's shoulders before answering. "I only listen when he speaks, my lord. I do not know why it works. I only know that he seems to need to be heard without being rushed. Whatever it is you are doing," Damien said quietly, "do not stop." He lingered longer than he needed to that night, watching from the doorway as Elena finished settling Kai for sleep, and Elena, though she kept her eyes carefully on the boy, found herself deeply aware of the king's presence in a way that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Not everyone in the palace shared the king's relief. Lady Miriam Ashcroft, a widowed noblewoman who had spent the better part of the last year positioning her own young niece as a future companion for the grieving prince, watched Elena's rising position with open displeasure. She had spent months cultivating relationships with the household staff, ensuring that when the time came for the king to consider a new companion for his son, her family's name would be the first one spoken. A nameless kitchen servant succeeding where careful, patient planning had failed was not a development she intended to accept quietly. "A servant," Lady Ashcroft said one evening, seated in the drawing room of Lord Edwin Marsh, one of the king's senior advisors, over a glass of spiced wine. "A girl with no family name, no history anyone can properly account for, suddenly given quarters near the royal nursery, and the king's personal attention. Does this not strike you as troubling, Edwin?" Lord Marsh, a thin, careful man who had served 3 generations of the Voss pack, considered his words before speaking, as he always did. "The prince is speaking again, Miriam. After a year of silence, that is difficult to argue against, regardless of who accomplished it. And when this girl grows too comfortable in her position, when she begins to influence more than a child's bedtime stories, the king is a widower with no queen at his side. A clever girl in the right position, at the right time, could rise a very long way in this court." Lady Ashcroft's eyes narrowed. "I intend to learn everything there is to know about Elena Whitmore, where she came from, who her family was, why a girl with no recorded history appeared in this palace 8 months ago and immediately found her way, however slowly, into the very heart of the royal household." Lord Marsh did not entirely disagree, though he kept his caution to himself. He had served long enough in this court to know that sudden rises in fortune rarely came without consequence, for the person who rose, or for those around them. Elena, unaware of the quiet campaign building against her in the drawing rooms of the court, continued her days much as she had for the past 2 weeks. Her world narrowed to the nursery, to Kai's growing laughter, to the strange, careful warmth that had begun to grow between herself and a king she still did not fully understand. But her nights had begun to change as well. The dreams came more often now, ever since her elevation to the nursery had placed her so close to the family whose tragedy still haunted every corner of the palace. She dreamed of smoke, thick and choking, of heat pressing against her skin, of a woman's voice calling out a name through the roar of flames, a name that was not quite Elena, though it felt achingly familiar every time she woke gasping in the darkness of her new quarters. She dreamed of a fire that was not the one that had taken her parents when she was small. She was certain of that now, though she could not say how she knew it. The fire in her dreams was different, larger, filled with the sound of a woman screaming for someone to run, to hide, to not look back. She told no one about the dreams. She had learned, long ago, that unexplainable things were dangerous to speak of in places like this palace, where every word could be turned into a weapon by someone patient enough to wait for the right moment. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after Kai had first spoken her name, Elena found herself alone in the nursery after the boy had fallen asleep, straightening the small toys scattered across the rug, when Damien appeared in the doorway once again. This time, instead of remaining near the threshold, he crossed the room and sat down on the low bench near the window, watching her work in a silence that felt different from his usual reserved distance. "May I ask you something, Elena?" She paused, a small wooden horse still in her hand. "Of course, my lord. Where is your family? I have looked through the household records, and I find very little about you before you arrived here 8 months ago." Elena's hands stilled. She had known this question would come eventually. She had simply hoped it would come later, after she had built enough trust, enough safety, to know how to answer it without risking everything she had begun to build. "My parents died when I was very young, my lord. A fire, in a village to the south. I was raised afterward by an aunt, who has since passed as well. I came to the city looking for work, and the palace was hiring kitchen staff. There is not much more to tell." It was, mostly, the truth. It was also, she knew, not the whole truth, though she could not have said exactly what was missing from it, only that something about her own history felt incomplete, in a way she had never fully examined. Damien studied her for a long moment, and Elena felt again that strange flicker behind his eyes, the same searching look she had noticed during their very first meeting in his study. "A fire," he said quietly. "You lost your parents to a fire." "Yes, my lord. As my son lost his mother." Damien's gaze drifted toward the sleeping boy across the room. "Perhaps that is part of why he trusts you. Grief recognizes grief, even in those too young to understand what they are recognizing." Elena said nothing, though something about his words settled uneasily in her chest, closer to the truth than either of them yet understood. "I will not press you further tonight," Damien said, rising from the bench. "But I would ask you to think carefully, Elena, about your aunt, about the village you came from. Sometimes the details we consider unimportant turn out to matter a great deal, in places like this." He left the nursery without further explanation, and Elena stood alone in the quiet room for a long while afterward, turning his words over in her mind, feeling for the first time a cold thread of unease, weaving through the fragile warmth she had allowed herself to feel over the past 3 weeks. She did not know, not yet, how right the king's instinct truly was. Nor did she know that in a chamber not far from the nursery, General Callan Rourke had already begun sending quiet inquiries south, toward a village that had burned to the ground nearly 2 decades ago, seeking answers to questions Elena herself had never thought to ask. The Queen Mother arrived at the palace on a gray morning, nearly a month after Elena had first entered the nursery, her carriage rolling through the front gates, with an escort of 6 guards, and a reputation that made even the most senior members of the household staff straighten their backs and check their appearances twice before greeting her. Isolde Voss, mother to the king and grandmother to young Kai, had spent the past year at her private estate in the northern hills, unable to bear the sight of the palace where her daughter-in-law had died. Her return was not announced with celebration. It was announced with quiet, tense preparation, every servant in the palace aware that the old Queen Mother's sharp eyes missed nothing, and forgave even less. Elena learned of the arrival from Mistress Halbrook, who delivered the news with the particular briskness she reserved for matters of genuine importance. "The Queen Mother will wish to see her grandson immediately upon her arrival," Mistress Halbrook said, straightening the collar of Elena's uniform with quick, efficient hands, as though preparing her for an inspection. "You will present him properly, and then remove yourself, unless she requests otherwise. Do you understand? The Queen Mother does not tolerate servants who overstep, and she will have opinions about your position in that nursery. Mark my words." Elena understood well enough. She had spent the past month growing more comfortable in her role, more confident in the quiet rhythm she had built with Kai, and she had almost allowed herself to forget how precarious that comfort truly was. The Queen Mother's arrival was a sharp reminder that her place in this palace remained, at its core, entirely dependent on the goodwill of people far more powerful than herself. She dressed Kai in his finest clothes that morning, smoothing his dark hair with careful hands, and led him down to the receiving hall, where Isolde Voss waited beside her son the king, still wrapped in her traveling cloak, her expression unreadable. Kai, who had grown so much more confident over the past weeks, hesitated at the sight of his grandmother, pressing himself slightly behind Elena's skirts. Isolde's sharp eyes noticed the movement immediately, and something in her expression shifted, though whether toward warmth or displeasure, Elena could not yet tell. "Kai," Isolde said softly, kneeling despite her age, and the stiffness that clearly cost her some effort. "Do you remember your grandmother?" For a long moment, the boy said nothing, and Elena felt her heart clench with worry, remembering how long it had taken him to trust her own presence. But then, slowly, Kai stepped forward, away from the shelter of Elena's skirts, and allowed his grandmother to draw him into an embrace. I remember, he said quietly. You smell like the roses in the garden. Isolde's composed expression cracked, just slightly, and Elena saw the old woman's eyes grow bright with tears. She was clearly fighting to hold back. He is speaking, Isolde said, looking up at her son. Damien, he is speaking. He has been. For nearly a month now, Damien said, and Elena did not miss the way his gaze flickered toward her as he spoke. A silent acknowledgement of exactly who deserved the credit for this change. Isolde followed her son's gaze, taking in Elena's presence properly for the first time, her sharp eyes moving slowly from Elena's plain servant's uniform to her face, studying her with an intensity that made Elena want to look at the floor and resist the urge in equal measure. You are the girl I have heard about, Isolde said finally. The nursery servant. Yes, my lady. Elena Whitmore. Whitmore. Isolde repeated the name slowly, as though testing its weight, and something flickered across her face, gone before Elena could name it. I do not know that family name. Where are you from, child? A village to the south, my lady. It no longer exists. It burned many years ago. Isolde's expression grew very still. Burned, she repeated. How many years ago exactly? Elena hesitated, uncertain why the question seemed to carry such weight for the old woman. Nearly 20 years, my lady. I was very small. I do not remember the village itself, only what my aunt told me afterward. For a long moment, Isolde said nothing at all, her eyes distant, as though she was turning something over in her mind that had nothing to do with the conversation in front of her. Then, just as quickly as the strange stillness had come over her, she seemed to shake it off, rising to her feet with the careful dignity of a woman who had spent her entire life learning to hide what she truly felt. Well, Isolde said, her voice returning to its formal, measured tone. Whatever you have done for my grandson, girl, you have my gratitude. Do not let it go to your head. Gratitude in this court is a fragile thing, easily spent and rarely renewed. She left the receiving hall with Damien at her side, leaving Elena standing alone, with Kai's small hand still clutched in her own, an uneasy feeling settling over her that she could not quite explain. The old Queen Mother's reaction to the mention of a fire, 20 years past, in a village whose name Elena herself had never learned, felt like more than simple curiosity. It felt like recognition. She did not have long to sit with that unease before the next challenge arrived. That evening, as Elena walked through the servants' corridor toward her quarters, she found her path blocked by Lady Miriam Ashcroft's personal maid, a sharp-featured young woman named Prudence, who had clearly been waiting for her. My lady wishes to speak with you, Prudence said, her tone carrying an edge of superiority that servants of higher-ranking households often adopted toward those they considered beneath them. Now, if you please, she does not enjoy waiting. Elena had no real choice but to follow, her stomach tight with a nervousness she tried and failed to fully suppress. She was led to a small sitting room where Lady Ashcroft waited, seated in a high-backed chair, with the posture of a woman who had spent her entire life being watched and had learned to make every movement deliberate. Elena Whitmore, Lady Ashcroft said, not bothering to offer her a seat. I have heard a great deal about you these past weeks. The servant who healed the silent prince. Quite the remarkable story for a girl of such humble origins. I only did what any caretaker would try to do, my lady. Did you? Lady Ashcroft's smile did not reach her eyes. I wonder, Elena, whether you understand the position you have placed yourself in. The king is a widower. His son has grown attached to you in a manner some might call unnatural, for a servant, and you yourself seem to have appeared from nowhere, with no family, no history, no connections to speak of. Does that not strike you as a rather convenient set of circumstances for a girl hoping to rise beyond her station? Elena's spine straightened despite herself, a flicker of the same stubbornness that had kept her chin level in the king's study weeks earlier rising to meet the challenge in Lady Ashcroft's voice. I have no intention of rising beyond anything, my lady. I care for the prince because he needed someone, and I was there, nothing more. How admirably humble. Lady Ashcroft's tone made clear she believed none of it. I will be watching you closely. Elena Whitmore. If I discover that your intentions in this palace extend beyond the nursery, I will make certain the king learns of it, and I will make certain your fall from whatever fortune you imagine you have found is swift and thorough. Do we understand each other? Perfectly, my lady. Elena left the sitting room, with her hands trembling slightly at her sides, though she kept her expression carefully composed until she was safely back in the privacy of her own quarters. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at nothing, feeling for the first time the full weight of exactly how many eyes had turned toward her in the past month. How many people in this palace were watching her rise with suspicion, jealousy, or something far more dangerous than either. She thought of Ruth's warning, weeks earlier, about attention in this palace rarely landing softly. She thought of the Queen Mother's strange stillness at the mention of a fire 20 years past. She thought of Damien's careful question about her aunt, her village, the details he had urged her to think carefully about. Something was moving beneath the surface of this palace, something larger and older than her own small place within it, and Elena was beginning to understand, with a growing unease she could not shake, that she had wandered into the middle of it without ever fully realizing the danger she carried, simply by being who she was. In the nursery down the hall, Kai slept peacefully for the first time in over a year, unaware of the storm quietly gathering around the woman he had already begun to think of, in his small and uncomplicated heart, as his mother. General Callan Rourke's inquiries took nearly 3 weeks to bear fruit, and when they did, they arrived in the form of a single letter, carried by a tired courier who had ridden hard from the southern territories. A letter that Callan read twice, in the privacy of his chamber, before setting it down with hands that were not entirely steady. The village Elena claimed as her birthplace had indeed burned nearly 20 years ago, exactly as she had said, but the letter contained details that Elena herself did not know, details that no aunt had ever shared with her, details that made the hair on the back of Callan's neck rise as he read them by candlelight. The fire that destroyed that village had not been an accident of storm or careless flame. Local records, preserved by a pack historian who remembered the event clearly, described it as a deliberate act, a raid carried out by a rival pack faction seeking to destroy a bloodline connected, through careful marriage generations earlier, to the royal line of the Voss pack itself. The raid had been thorough. Nearly every family with that bloodline connection had perished in the flames. Only one child, a girl not yet 2 years old, had been reported missing from the wreckage, never found among the dead, never accounted for in any record afterward. Callan set the letter down and stared at the candle flame for a long time, his mind working through the implications with the same careful precision he applied to every threat that crossed his path. If the letter was accurate, Elena Whitmore was not simply a fortunate servant who happened to have a gift with grieving children. She was the last surviving member of a bloodline someone had once tried very hard to erase entirely, a bloodline tied closely enough to the royal family that her survival, 20 years later, appearing quietly in the palace kitchens, could not possibly be the coincidence it had seemed. He thought of Queen Seraphina, of the fire that had taken her only 18 months ago, of the whispers that it had not been an accident either. He thought of how quickly, how easily, Elena had found her way into the heart of the royal household, into the trust of the king and the prince both, and he found himself caught between two possibilities that felt equally dangerous. Either Elena was exactly what she appeared to be, an innocent survivor of an old tragedy who had wandered by chance into a new one, or she was something far more calculated, a piece placed carefully on the board by whoever had orchestrated both fires, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal her purpose. He did not yet know which possibility frightened him more. That same evening, unaware of the letter that had just reshaped every assumption Callan held about her, Elena sat in the nursery mending a small tear in one of Kai's shirts, while the boy played quietly on the rug nearby, building a tower out of wooden blocks, with the patient concentration of a child who had finally learned to trust that his toys, and his world, would remain steady beneath his hands. Her own mind was elsewhere, caught in the strange, half-formed dreams that had grown more vivid and more frequent with each passing week. That night, as she finally allowed herself to rest after Kai had fallen asleep, the dream returned with a clarity sharper than any she had experienced before. She saw a woman's face this time, clearer than in any previous dream, a face with the same storm-gray eyes she had come to know so well in Kai's small features. The woman was holding her, running through smoke and heat, whispering urgently against her ear, words Elena could almost, but not quite, make out. She saw fire consuming a wooden structure behind them, heard shouting voices, felt the woman's arms tighten protectively around her as they moved. And then, just before the dream released her back into waking, She heard the woman say a name clearly for the first time. Not Elena, a different name entirely, soft and unfamiliar, and yet it struck something so deep inside her that she woke gasping, her heart pounding, tears already wet on her cheeks before she fully understood why she was crying. She lay awake for the rest of the night, turning the fragments over in her mind, trying to separate what might be memory from what might simply be the product of an anxious mind, grasping for meaning in random images. But the woman's face lingered behind her closed eyes, with a persistence that felt like more than imagination, and the unfamiliar name echoed in her thoughts, with a weight that felt disturbingly like recognition. The next morning, exhausted and unsettled, Elena made a decision she had avoided for weeks. She sought out Mistress Halbrook during a quiet hour between the morning and midday duties, and asked, as carefully as she could manage, whether the household kept any records of servants and staff going back 20 years, records that might include information about her own arrival in the region as a small child. Mistress Halbrook, surprised by the question, but not unkind, directed her to the old records room in the palace's lower levels, a dusty chamber rarely visited except by the household's official record keeper. Elena spent nearly an hour searching through ledgers and files with trembling hands, uncertain exactly what she was looking for, only that some instinct insisted she needed to look. She did not find her own name. But in a ledger recording notable regional events from 20 years past, tucked between records of harvests and taxes, she found a brief entry describing the destruction of a southern village, the same event her aunt had always described simply as an accident, described here, in far more troubling terms. A deliberate raid, a bloodline targeted, a missing child, never recovered. Elena sat with the ledger open on her lap for a long time, the words blurring slightly, as her eyes filled with tears she did not fully understand. She thought of her aunt, a quiet, careful woman who had raised her with love, but had always deflected any questions about her parents, about the fire, about anything from before Elena's earliest clear memories. She had always assumed her aunt's reluctance came from grief, from a desire to protect a small child from painful details. Now she wondered if it had come from something else entirely, a deliberate effort to keep her hidden, to keep her safe from something her aunt had understood far better than Elena herself ever had. She closed the ledger carefully and returned it to its shelf, her mind spinning with questions she did not know how to begin answering. Was she the missing child described in that brief clinical entry? Was the woman in her dreams her true mother, killed in a fire meant to erase her family entirely? And if so, why had that fire happened at all? Who had wanted her bloodline destroyed so thoroughly that they had been willing to burn an entire village to accomplish it? She thought, with a growing chill, of Queen Seraphina's death in a fire that everyone quietly suspected had not been an accident either. 2 fires, 2 royal-adjacent bloodlines, separated by nearly 20 years. The coincidence felt too large to ignore, and yet Elena had no idea what connection, if any, truly existed between herself and the tragedy that had silenced Kai for over a year. She did not go to Damien with her questions that day, uncertain what she would even say, uncertain whether revealing her confusion would help her position in this palace, or destroy it entirely. Instead, she carried the weight of her half-formed discoveries alone, tucking them away the way she had learned to tuck away every painful thing in her life, and returned to the nursery where Kai waited, unaware of anything except the simple joy of having someone steady and present in his small world. But that evening, as she helped him prepare for bed, Kai said something that made her blood run cold. "Mama," he said sleepily, his eyes already half closed, "the lady in my dream says hello to you too." Elena's hands stilled on the blanket she was tucking around him. "What lady, sweetheart?" "The pretty lady with the gray eyes. She comes in my dreams sometimes. She says she is watching over both of us." Kai yawned, already drifting toward sleep, entirely unaware of the impact his sleepy words had just had on the woman sitting beside him. "She says you belong here. With us." Elena sat frozen beside the sleeping boy for a long time, after his breathing evened into sleep, her heart pounding, the fragments of her own dreams colliding with his words in a way that felt far too precise to dismiss as simple childish imagination. She did not know what any of it meant. She only knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that whatever force had brought her into this palace, into this nursery, into the small, trusting hand of a king's silent son, it was far larger and far older than mere coincidence. Somewhere in this palace, or perhaps beyond its walls entirely. Someone had once tried very hard to erase her from existence. And somewhere within herself, buried beneath years of careful, deliberate forgetting, Elena was beginning to suspect that she carried a truth about her own identity that could change everything, not just for herself, but for the king, for his silent son who had finally learned to speak again, and for the fragile, uncertain peace that had settled over this palace since the day a small boy had reached for a stranger's hand and called her by a name he should never have known to use. General Callan Rourke did not go to the king immediately with what he had learned. He had served Damien long enough to know that half-formed suspicions, brought forward without careful verification, could do more damage than good, especially where the safety of the young prince was concerned. Instead, he decided to observe Elena himself, to watch her closely in the days that followed, searching for any sign that she was more than the grieving, confused young woman she appeared to be. What he found, over the course of a careful week of quiet observation, was not what he had expected. He watched her in the nursery through a partially opened door, unseen, as she read to Kai in a soft, patient voice, correcting his stumbling attempts at new words with gentle encouragement rather than impatience. He watched her in the gardens, walking slowly beside the boy, as he examined flowers and insects with the wide-eyed curiosity of a child finally allowed to be a child again. He watched her late one evening, believing herself alone, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, with an old ledger page she had copied down from the records room, tears streaming silently down her face as she read it again and again, as though searching for answers the words themselves could not provide. There was no calculation in what Callan observed. There was no cold ambition, no careful manipulation of a grieving family for personal gain. There was only a young woman, clearly as confused and unsettled by her own circumstances as anyone else in the palace, doing her genuine best for a child who had come to depend on her entirely. And yet the facts from the letter remained. Elena was, by every indication Callan could find, the missing child from a bloodline someone had once tried to erase, a bloodline connected closely enough to the royal family that her survival, and her sudden appearance in this exact palace, at this exact time, could not be entirely dismissed as chance. He decided, finally, that the king needed to know, regardless of how uncertain the full picture remained. He requested a private audience with Damien, on a quiet evening, after the day's formal business had concluded, and laid the letter and his own week of observations before the king, without embellishment, presenting the facts as plainly as he could manage. Damien read the letter twice, his expression growing darker with each pass, and when he finally set it down, his hands were clenched tightly enough that his knuckles had gone pale. "You believe Elena is the missing child from this raid," Damien said slowly. "The last survivor of a bloodline someone tried to destroy 20 years ago." "I believe it is possible, my lord. The timing of the fire matches her stated age. The description of the missing child matches what little we know of her early history. And the bloodline in question, according to the historian's notes, carries a distant but real connection to our own family line, through a marriage several generations past." Damien was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter as though it might rearrange itself into a less troubling shape if he looked at it long enough. "If this is true, Callan, then whoever destroyed that village 20 years ago was attempting to eliminate a bloodline connected to my own family, and 18 months ago, my wife died in a fire that has never been fully explained." He looked up, his eyes hard. "Do you believe these events are connected?" "I do not know, my lord, but I do not believe in coincidences large enough to span 20 years, and 2 fires touching the same family line. Someone, somewhere, has reason to want this bloodline gone entirely. And if Elena truly is, who I suspect she is, her presence in this palace, so close to your son, may not be safe. Not if the person responsible for either fire remains active within our walls." Damien rose from his chair and crossed to the window, looking out over the darkened gardens, exactly as he had on the night he first learned his son had spoken. The weight of what Callan was suggesting settled over him slowly, layer by layer. If Elena was truly connected to his family's bloodline, if someone within his own court had orchestrated not 1, but 2 attempts to eliminate that connection, then the danger surrounding his son had never truly ended with Serafina's death. It had simply gone quiet, waiting for its next opportunity. "Does she know?" Damien asked finally. "Does Elena understand what she might be?" I do not believe she knows the full truth, my lord, but I believe she suspects something. She has been visiting the record rooms. She has copied down entries related to the fire in her village. Something in her is beginning to piece the story together, whether she fully understands it yet or not. Damien was silent for a long time, weighing the delicate balance of protection and honesty that the situation demanded. Every instinct he possessed as a father urged him to remove Elena from the palace entirely, to sever any connection that might place his son in danger a second time. But another instinct, quieter and harder to name, resisted that solution entirely, unwilling to imagine his son's world without the woman who had brought him back from a year of silence, unwilling, if he was fully honest with himself, to imagine his own days without her steady, gentle presence in the halls of a palace that had felt hollow and grief-stricken for far too long. "We will not remove her," Damien said finally. "Not yet. If she is truly in danger, sending her away accomplishes nothing, except leaving her unprotected, alone, without the resources this palace can offer. She stays, but her movements will be watched more closely. Her safety will be treated with the same seriousness as my son's own. And you will continue your inquiries, Callan. I want to know everything there is to know about who ordered that raid 20 years ago, and whether that same hand reached into this palace to take my wife from us as well." Callan bowed, though something in his expression suggested he had expected, and perhaps hoped for, exactly this decision. "It will be done, my lord." As Callan turned to leave, Damien stopped him with a final question, quieter than the rest, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with strategy or protection. "Callan, do you believe she is truly connected to us? Not merely to some distant, forgotten branch of the family tree, but to us. To Serafina, to Kai." Callan considered his answer carefully before speaking. "I believe, my lord, that whatever the full truth turns out to be, that young woman has already become connected to your son in a way that matters far more than any bloodline recorded in an old ledger. Whatever else we discover, I do not believe that particular truth will change." Damien said nothing more, but long after Callan had gone, he remained at the window, staring out into the darkness, turning over a growing certainty he had been resisting for weeks. He thought of Elena's storm-gray eyes, so unsettlingly similar to his late wife's own, of the strange, instinctive way Kai had reached for her from the very first day, of the fire that had taken his family and the fire that had taken hers, separated by 20 years, and yet bound together by a thread he was only now beginning to fully understand. Whatever Elena Whitmore truly was, whoever she had been before she wandered into his palace kitchens 8 months ago, Damien was beginning to understand that her arrival in his household had never been mere coincidence. Something larger was moving beneath the surface of his court, something that had already cost him his wife once, and he intended to uncover every piece of it before it had the chance to cost him anything, or anyone, ever again. 2 floors above him, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place, Elena sat beside Kai's bed long after the boy had fallen asleep, the copied ledger page still tucked carefully into the pocket of her uniform, her mind turning over questions that had no answers yet, only a growing, unshakable certainty that her quiet, careful life was about to change in ways she could not begin to predict. In 3 days, the court would gather for the autumn assembly, the first formal event since Queen Serafina's death that would bring every lord, lady, and dignitary of the Voss territory into a single hall. Elena had been informed only that morning that she would be expected to attend alongside Kai, to help settle him through the long formal proceedings. She did not yet know that the assembly would become the moment her carefully guarded secret and the king's own quiet decision about her place in his household would collide in front of the entire court, with no way left to keep either one hidden any longer. The morning of the autumn assembly arrived with a gray sky and a palace humming, with more activity than Elena had witnessed in her entire 8 months of service. Servants rushed through every corridor, carrying flowers, polished silver, and formal banners, bearing the wolf and iron crown of the Voss pack. Cooks worked through the night to prepare a feast worthy of dignitaries traveling from every corner of the territory, and in the nursery, Elena dressed Kai in a small formal coat that matched, in miniature, the deep blue and silver his father would wear, her fingers trembling slightly as she fastened each small button. "Are you nervous, Mama?" Kai asked, watching her face with the careful attentiveness he had learned to bring to every interaction since regaining his voice. Elena forced a smile, smoothing down his dark hair. A little. There will be many important people at the assembly today. We will stand quietly near the back and watch, and if you grow tired, you tell me, and we will find somewhere quiet to rest. Can you do that for me? Kai nodded solemnly, though Elena suspected, even as she said the words, that keeping a 3-year-old still and quiet, through hours of formal proceedings, was a promise easier made than kept. Her own nerves had little to do with the assembly's length. In the days since her conversation with Mistress Halbrook, since her discoveries in the record room, since Kai's unsettling words about the lady with the gray eyes, Elena had felt a growing sense that something enormous was gathering, just beyond her ability to see it clearly. She did not know what today's assembly would bring. She only knew, with the same instinct that had guided her through every difficult moment of her careful, quiet life, that she needed to be ready for anything. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion. Long tables lined the walls, heavy with autumn fruit and polished silver. Banners hung from the high rafters, and every lord and lady of standing within the Voss territory had gathered in their finest formal dress, along with a scattering of dignitaries from neighboring packs, come to witness the king's first major public assembly since his wife's death. At the head of the hall, on the raised dais where the throne stood, Alpha King Damien Voss waited in formal attire, his expression composed into the careful neutrality he wore for every public occasion, giving nothing away of the turmoil that had occupied his private thoughts for the past several days. Elena took her position near the back of the hall, exactly as instructed, with Kai's small hand held firmly in her own. From this distance, she could see the entire gathering spread before her, could feel the weight of formal power pressing down on the room, in a way that made her acutely aware of exactly how far she was from where she belonged in this world. Lady Miriam Ashcroft stood near the front of the assembly, resplendent in deep burgundy silk, her young niece positioned carefully beside her, and Elena caught the noblewoman's sharp, appraising glance sweeping toward the back of the hall more than once. Lord Edwin Marsh stood among the king's senior advisors, his expression as carefully unreadable as ever. Queen Mother Isolde occupied a seat of honor near the throne, her sharp eyes moving across the gathered crowd with the same watchful precision Elena had come to expect from their brief but memorable meeting weeks earlier. General Callan Rourke stood near the base of the dais, positioned exactly where he could observe both the king and the gathered nobility, and though Elena did not know the full weight of what he had learned about her in recent weeks, she felt his gaze find her more than once across the crowded hall, careful and considering in a way that made her skin prickle with unease. The formal proceedings began exactly as such gatherings always did, with lengthy speeches from visiting dignitaries, with reports on the territory's harvest and trade agreements, with the slow, ceremonial rhythm that Elena had been warned would stretch on for hours. She kept Kai occupied as best she could, offering him small distractions, whispering quiet explanations of what was happening, and for the better part of an hour, the strategy worked well enough. But children, even remarkably resilient children who had only recently rediscovered their own voices, have limits to their patience, and as the second hour of formal speeches wore on, Elena felt Kai growing restless beside her, his small body shifting from foot to foot, his attention wandering from the proceedings toward anything more interesting than yet another lord discussing grain tariffs. She knelt beside him, whispering that they could step toward the doors for a moment of fresh air, and it was in that instant, as she straightened and reached for his hand, that Kai's attention caught on something across the great hall that Elena, from her position, could not immediately identify. She would spend the rest of her life trying to reconstruct exactly what happened next, replaying the sequence of events with a clarity that never fully faded, no matter how many years passed. Kai pulled his hand free from hers with a sudden, determined strength, and before Elena could react, before Mistress Halbrook, standing nearby, could reach out to catch him, the boy broke into a run. He ran across the great marble floor of the assembly hall, past the astonished faces of lords and ladies who parted instinctively before him, his small formal coat catching the light from the high windows, his eyes fixed entirely on his father seated upon the raised dais at the front of the room. Guards stationed along the walls startled at the sudden movement, uncertain whether to intervene in what appeared, at first glance, to be some breach of protocol involving the young prince. Lady Ashcroft's sharp gasp was audible even from the back of the hall. Queen Mother Isolde half rose from her seat, one hand pressed to her chest. But Kai did not stop at the dais. He did not run toward his father at all. He turned, at the last moment, away from the throne, and ran instead directly back toward Elena, who had frozen in shock partway across the hall, uncertain what had just happened, uncertain whether she was meant to chase after the prince or wait for him to return on his own. He reached her in seconds, wrapping his small arms around her legs with the same desperate, trusting grip he had shown on that very first day in the nursery, and lifted his face toward hers, his storm-gray eyes bright and certain in a way that carried absolutely no hesitation, no uncertainty, nothing but pure, simple truth, spoken by a child too young to understand the weight his words were about to carry. "Mama," Kai cried, loud enough that his small voice rang clearly across the sudden, startled silence that had already begun spreading through the great hall. "Mama, I want to sit with you." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the silence that followed spread outward in slow, widening rings, until it had swallowed the entire assembly hall whole. Speeches died mid-sentence. Goblets stopped halfway to lips. Every single person gathered in that grand hall, from the visiting dignitaries to the household staff standing quietly along the walls, turned to look at the small servant girl, standing frozen near the back of the room, the king's only son, wrapped tightly around her legs, having just declared, in front of the entire Voss court, that she was his mother. Elena felt every eye in the hall settle on her at once, a weight so physical she could barely breathe beneath it. She looked up, past the sea of shocked and staring faces, toward the raised dais at the front of the hall, and found Alpha King Damien Voss, already on his feet, his composed, formal expression completely gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded that Elena had never once seen on his face in all their previous meetings. No one in that hall breathed, not the lords who had spent months whispering about the mysterious servant girl's rise, not Lady Ashcroft, whose careful plans had just crumbled in front of the entire court, not Queen Mother Isolde, whose sharp eyes had gone wide with something far more complicated than simple shock. Not General Callan Rourke, whose hand had drifted instinctively toward his side, uncertain whether the moment called for protection or restraint. Every single person in that hall waited, in absolute suspended silence, to see what the Alpha King would do. Damien descended the steps of the dais slowly, deliberately, every eye in the hall following his movement as he crossed the marble floor toward the place where Elena stood frozen, Kai still wrapped tightly around her legs. Elena felt her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone nearby could hear it, certain that whatever happened in the next few moments would determine not only her own fate within this palace, but Kai's fragile, hard-won stability as well. She began, quickly and quietly, to try to explain. "My lord, I never taught him to say this, I never encouraged." "I know," Damien said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it clearly. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at his son, who had not loosened his grip on Elena's legs in the slightest, his small face turned upward with the same open, trusting certainty that had first spoken her name weeks earlier in the quiet nursery. "I know you did not teach him this, Elena. I have watched you with him for over a month now. You have never once claimed a title that was not yours to claim." He knelt down, bringing himself level with his son, and gently rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Kai, do you understand what you have just said, in front of all these people?" Kai looked between his father and Elena, his young face suddenly uncertain, as though only now beginning to sense the weight the moment carried, a weight far beyond his understanding. "Is it wrong, Papa? Elena takes care of me. She sings to me, and reads to me, and she does not leave, even when I am tired and difficult. Mama used to do those things too, before she went to the stars." His small chin trembled, though his voice held steady. "I do not remember Mama's face very well anymore, but I remember what it felt like when she held me. It feels like that, when Elena holds me. So I called her Mama. Is that wrong?" The hall remained utterly silent, every noble and dignitary straining to hear the quiet exchange taking place between the king, his son, and the servant girl who had, in the span of a single moment, become the center of the entire court's attention. Damien was quiet for a long moment, and Elena watched something complicated move behind his eyes, grief and hope and old caution, all tangled together, in a way she recognized because she had felt it herself. every single day since Kai had first spoken her name. "It is not wrong," Damien said finally, his voice carrying clearly enough now that it reached the nearest rows of the gathered nobility. "It is not wrong at all." He rose to his feet, turning to face the hall fully, and Elena felt the shift in him immediately, the careful, composed king, replacing the kneeling father, in the span of a single breath, though something in his posture remained different than it had before, less guarded, as though whatever had just happened had cracked something open in him that he no longer had any interest in sealing shut again. "For those of you wondering whether you have witnessed some breach of protocol this afternoon," Damien said, his voice carrying the full authority of the Alpha King across the silent hall, "let me be clear. My son has not spoken a single word since the fire that took his mother from us, until the day this young woman entered his life. In the weeks since, he has laughed again. He has asked questions again. He has slept through the night without waking in fear, for the first time in over a year. Whatever bond exists between them was not manufactured, was not sought, and was not planted for any purpose beyond a servant's honest kindness toward a grieving child who needed exactly that kindness to find his way back to himself." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the gathered court, lingering, for a moment, on Lady Ashcroft's stunned expression, on Lord Marsh's carefully neutral face, on his own mother's watchful, unreadable eyes. "Elena Whitmore will remain by my son's side, permanently, in whatever capacity best serves his well-being. I will hear no objections to this arrangement, from anyone in this hall." His eyes moved back to Elena, and something softened in them, just barely, just enough that she alone might have noticed it. "This court owes her a debt it can never fully repay. I do not intend to treat that debt lightly." The silence broke, finally, into a low murmur of astonished conversation, rippling through the assembled nobility, though none dared speak loudly enough to challenge the king's declaration directly. Elena stood frozen, Kai's small hand now clasped tightly in her own, uncertain whether to feel relief or a fresh wave of terror at exactly how publicly, how permanently, her fate had just been tied to the royal household. Queen Mother Isolde rose from her seat near the throne and made her way slowly through the parting crowd, her sharp eyes fixed on Elena with an intensity that made the younger woman's stomach tighten with fresh unease. She stopped before Elena, studying her face for a long moment, in a silence that felt far heavier than the noise of the murmuring court around them. "Whitmore," Isolde said quietly, repeating the name as she had weeks earlier, though this time her voice carried a different weight entirely. "I asked you once where that name came from, and you told me you did not know your family's full history. I believe, child, that the time has come for both of us to learn it properly." Elena's breath caught. "My lady?" "Not here," Isolde said, glancing meaningfully at the still murmuring crowd around them. "But soon. There are things about your face, your eyes, the age you claim, that have troubled me since the moment I first saw you, and I no longer believe I can afford to ignore that trouble any further." She moved away before Elena could ask anything further, leaving her standing amid the slowly dispersing crowd, with far more questions than she had carried into the great hall that morning. Not every reaction to the king's declaration was so measured. Lady Ashcroft approached Lord Marsh later that evening, once the formal assembly had concluded, and the great hall had emptied of its dignitaries, her composure entirely gone, replaced by a sharp, barely contained fury. "The king has just elevated a nameless kitchen servant above every noble family in this court, Edwin. Do you understand what this means? If he intends to keep her permanently at the prince's side, how long before whispers begin suggesting a far greater elevation still? A queen's position left empty for 18 months, and now a convenient beloved commoner standing exactly where a new queen might eventually stand." Lord Marsh considered her words carefully, as he always did, though this time, a flicker of genuine concern crossed his careful features. "The court will not accept a servant as queen, Miriam, regardless of how deeply the prince has attached himself to her. There are traditions, expectations, that even the Alpha King cannot simply set aside without consequence." "Then perhaps," Lady Ashcroft said, her voice dropping into something colder and more deliberate, "it falls to those of us who understand this court's traditions to ensure the king remembers them as well, before this girl rises any further than she already has." Neither of them noticed the quiet figure who had lingered near the doorway during their exchange, listening carefully before slipping away into the darkened corridor beyond, carrying word of their conversation towards someone who had been waiting, with growing impatience, for exactly this kind of opportunity to present itself. In the nursery that night, far removed from the tangled currents of ambition and suspicion moving through the rest of the palace, Elena tucked an exhausted but happy Kai into his bed, humming the same lullaby she had hummed on that very first day, when neither of them had known what the sound of her voice would come to mean. "Everyone was looking at us today," Kai murmured sleepily, his eyes already closing. "Was that all right, Mama?" Elena smoothed his dark hair back from his forehead, her heart full of an emotion too complicated to name, gratitude and fear, and a fierce, unexpected love, all tangled together into something she suspected she would spend a very long time trying to understand. "It was all right," she said softly. "It was more than all right." She did not yet know how much danger her elevation had just placed her in, how many careful plans had just been thrown into disarray by a small boy's honest, unhesitating declaration of love. She only knew, as she watched Kai finally drift into peaceful sleep, that whatever came next, she no longer had any intention of walking away from this palace, or from the small, storm-eyed boy who had called her Mama in front of an entire silent, breathless court. 3 days after the assembly, Queen Mother Isolde summoned Elena to her private chambers, a formal request delivered by one of Isolde's own attendants, rather than pass through the usual channels of Mistress Halbrook or the household staff. Elena arrived with her heart beating unsteadily, uncertain what to expect from a woman whose sharp, watchful presence had unsettled her from their very first meeting. Isolde's chambers were quiet and elegant, filled with old portraits and carefully preserved mementos of a long life spent at the heart of the Vosspack's history. She received Elena alone, waving away her attendants with a brief gesture, and gestured for Elena to sit in a chair positioned close to her own. "I have spent the past 3 days going through old family records," Isolde said without preamble. "Records that I have not looked at in nearly 20 years, because looking at them has always been too painful. I believe, Elena, that I finally understand why your face has troubled me since the moment I first saw it." She reached into a small wooden box on the table beside her and withdrew a portrait, faded with age, and held it out for Elena to take. Elena's hands trembled as she accepted it, and her breath caught in her throat the instant her eyes fell on the painted image. The woman in the portrait had storm-gray eyes, the same eyes Elena saw every time she looked at Kai, the same eyes that had haunted her dreams for weeks. But it was not only the eyes, the shape of the face, the line of the jaw, the particular tilt of the head, all of it felt disturbingly, unmistakably familiar, as though Elena was looking at a reflection of herself, painted decades before she had been born. "Who is this?" Elena whispered. "My younger sister," Isolde said quietly. "Marguerite. She married beneath her station, against our family's wishes, to a man from a minor southern bloodline, and moved south to build a life away from the politics of this court. I loved her dearly, though we grew apart in her final years, as families sometimes do. She had a daughter, a beautiful girl with her mother's exact eyes." Isolde's voice grew unsteady. "I received word, nearly 20 years ago, that Marguerite's entire village had burned in a raid. I was told there were no survivors. I grieved my sister and her family, and I never learned the details beyond that brief, terrible report." Elena's hands tightened around the portrait, tears already blurring her vision. "You believe I am her daughter. I believe it with a certainty I cannot fully explain through logic alone, though the facts support it well enough. Your age matches, the timing of the fire matches, and your face, Elena, is my sister's face, exactly as I remember it, exactly as this portrait preserves it." Isolde reached out and gently took Elena's hand in her own weathered fingers. "If I am right, you are my great niece. You carry Voss blood, however distantly, through a line I believed entirely lost 20 years ago. And that means, if I am right, that Kai has not simply attached himself to a kind stranger who happened to cross his path. He has found his way, against every possible odd, back to family he did not know he still had." Elena sat in stunned silence, the portrait still trembling in her hands, trying to absorb a truth so much larger than anything she had allowed herself to imagine, even in her most unsettled moments of half-remembered dreams and unexplained instinct. She thought of her aunt, of the careful, deliberate way the woman had always deflected questions about her origins, and she understood now, with painful clarity, that her aunt had likely known exactly who she was, and had spent Elena's entire childhood protecting her from a truth, and a danger, too large for a small girl to safely carry. "Who ordered the raid?" Elena asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. If this bloodline connection is real, someone wanted it destroyed badly enough to burn an entire village. Who would do such a thing? And why? Isolde's expression grew grim. That is the question General Rourke has been trying to answer for weeks now, and I fear we are close to a truth none of us will find easy to accept. She hesitated, choosing her next words with visible care. There have long been factions within our own court who believe the Voss bloodline should remain pure of any outside connection, who view distant relations like my sister's family as a dilution of power rather than an expansion of it. I did not want to believe such feelings could drive a man to violence on this scale. I am no longer certain I have that luxury. Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent knock at the door. Isolde's attendant entered, flushed and breathless, announcing that General Rourke required an immediate audience with both of them, a request unusual enough in its urgency that Isolde rose from her chair at once. Callan arrived moments later, his expression grim in a way that made Elena's stomach twist with fresh dread, before he had even spoken a single word. "My Lord Voss has asked me to gather you both," Callan said. "We have identified the source of the letters, records, and quiet influence that led to the raid 20 years ago, and I believe the same source is connected to Queen Seraphina's death as well. It is Lord Garrick Thorne." Elena did not recognize the name, but Isolde's face went pale with a shock that told her the revelation carried enormous weight. "Garrick has served on the King's Council for over 15 years, Isolde said slowly. "He was one of Seraphina's most trusted advisors. Damien considers him a close friend. Which is precisely why no one has questioned his movements closely. Until now," Callan said grimly. "I found records, hidden within his private study, connecting him to correspondence with the faction responsible for the raid 20 years ago, a faction he quietly funded and directed under a false identity. I also found evidence suggesting he arranged for the fire that killed Queen Seraphina, motivated by a belief that her growing influence over the king threatened his own long-held position within this court. He viewed her, and any bloodline connected to her family's growing influence, as a threat to the pure line of succession he believed should remain unchallenged." Elena's breath left her in a rush. He wanted to destroy the queen's influence, and my family's bloodline, for the same reason, because we represented outside connections he viewed as threats. "That is our belief, yes," Callan confirmed. "And now, with your public elevation at the assembly 3 days ago, with the king's declaration that you will remain permanently at the prince's side, I believe Garrick views you as an active, immediate threat to whatever plans he still holds for this court's future. My Lord Voss has ordered Garrick's arrest for this evening, once we have gathered sufficient guards to ensure it can be carried out without incident. But I have come to warn you both, and to warn Elena especially, that until that arrest is carried out, you remain in genuine danger." Elena's mind raced back through every interaction she had ever had within this palace, searching for any sign of Lord Garrick Thorne that she might have overlooked, any moment where his hidden hostility might have shown itself. She found nothing specific, only a vague memory of a tall, composed man she had occasionally seen in the company of the king's senior advisors, a man who had never drawn particular attention to himself, precisely because he had spent 15 years carefully cultivating exactly that kind of unremarkable presence. "Where is Kai now?" Elena asked, fear sharpening her voice. "Is he safe?" "He is with the king, under heavy guard, in the private wing," Callan assured her. "I would ask you to remain here, in the Queen Mother's chambers, until the arrest is complete. This room is well guarded, and Garrick would not risk moving against you in a space this heavily protected." Elena wanted desperately to go to Kai immediately, every instinct screaming at her to be at his side, but she understood the wisdom in Callan's caution, understood that adding herself to the equation of an active arrest could complicate matters in ways that might endanger everyone involved. She forced herself to remain seated, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, as Callan departed to oversee the arrest, leaving her alone with Isolde in a tense, anxious silence that stretched on for what felt like hours. It was nearly dark when Corwin arrived at the chamber door, his expression carefully controlled in the manner of a soldier delivering difficult news. "The arrest did not go as planned," Corwin said. "Lord Thorne was warned somehow, and fled the grounds before our guards reached his quarters. We believe he had accomplices within the household staff, who alerted him to the king's suspicions. Elena's blood ran cold. Then he is still out there. Still a danger. The king has doubled the guard around the prince, and has requested you remain under close watch as well, Elena, until Thorn is located and properly dealt with. Corwin's expression grew grave. I would ask you both to remain here tonight. It is the safest location within the palace. Elena spent that night unable to sleep, curled in an unfamiliar bed within the Queen Mother's guest chamber, her mind cycling endlessly through fear for Kai, fear for herself, and a strange, disorienting grief for a family history she had only just learned she possessed, a history someone had once tried to erase entirely, and now seemed determined to finish erasing. She did not yet know that Lord Garrick Thorn, cornered and desperate, had not fled the palace grounds entirely as the guards believed. He remained hidden within the palace's oldest, least used wing, watching, waiting, and planning one final, desperate attempt to eliminate the threat that Elena's survival, and her growing bond with the young prince, now represented to everything he had spent 15 patient years building. Morning brought no word of Lord Garrick Thorn's capture, and the palace settled into a tense, watchful quiet. Every guard doubled at every entrance, every corridor patrolled with a vigilance that made the household staff move through their duties with hushed, anxious care. Elena spent the day in the Queen Mother's chambers, permitted only brief, heavily guarded visits to see Kai, who sensed the tension around him, without fully understanding its cause, clinging to her a little tighter than usual during each short reunion. It was General Callan Rourke who finally uncovered the break they needed, late that afternoon, when a groundskeeper reported unusual activity near the old eastern wing of the palace, a section that had been sealed off since the fire that killed Queen Seraphina 18 months earlier, considered too damaged and too painful for anyone to bother maintaining. Callan gathered a small, careful team of guards and made his way there himself, suspecting, correctly, that a man who had once destroyed that wing to hide his crimes might now be using its abandoned, half-ruined halls to hide himself. They found Lord Garrick Thorn in a small storage chamber near the wing's collapsed guest house, surrounded by papers and provisions that suggested he had been planning his escape for some time, perhaps anticipating that his schemes might eventually be discovered. When Callan's guards surrounded him, Thorn did not resist with force. He seemed, in the end, a smaller and more desperate man than the careful, composed advisor who had spent 15 years hiding in plain sight within the king's own council, his ambitions and fears finally laid bare in the flickering torchlight of the ruined chamber where his crimes had first been committed. He was taken into custody without further incident, and by evening, word had spread quietly through the palace that the danger, at last, had passed. Damien came to the Queen Mother's chambers himself to deliver the news to Elena, his expression carrying an exhaustion and relief so complete that it softened every hard line of authority he usually carried. Elena rose from her chair the moment he entered, searching his face for confirmation before he had even spoken. "It is done," Damien said quietly. "Thorn has confessed to everything. The raid on your village 20 years ago, the fire that killed Seraphina. Both crimes born from the same twisted belief that any bloodline connection beyond his narrow definition of purity represented a threat to this court's future. He will face judgment for what he has done, and he will never again have the opportunity to threaten this family. Or you." Elena's knees weakened with relief, and Damien crossed the room quickly, steadying her with a gentle hand at her elbow, a touch that lingered a moment longer than strict necessity required. "Kai," Elena said. "Is he?" "He is safe, and asleep, finally, after a very long day. I have doubled his guard permanently, and I intend to do the same for you, Elena, for as long as it takes for you to feel truly safe within these walls again." Damien's dark eyes searched her face with an intensity she had grown familiar with over the past weeks, though tonight it carried something new, something he no longer seemed inclined to hide. "I owe you an apology as well. I should have told you sooner what Callan and I suspected about your history. I was afraid that if you knew the danger you carried simply by existing, you might choose to leave, to protect yourself, and I found I was not prepared to lose you from this household, from my son's life." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "From my own life, if I am honest with you now, as I should have been from the beginning." Elena's breath caught, uncertain how to answer words that carried far more weight than simple gratitude for her safety. My lord, I do not know what to say to that. You do not need to say anything tonight, Damien said gently. You have endured enough for one day. But I want you to know, Elena, that whatever the court whispers, whatever traditions and expectations weigh against it, I have no intention of letting you disappear back into the quiet, unremarkable life you tried to build for yourself before my son found you. You are family, by blood, through the Queen Mother's sister. You are family, by choice, through every day you have spent caring for my son, as though he were your own. And I find, more and more with each passing week, that I would very much like you to be family, in every remaining sense as well, when you are ready, and not one single day before. Elena felt tears rise in her eyes, a tangle of exhaustion and relief, and a cautious, disbelieving hope she had spent her entire careful life refusing to allow herself to feel. I would like that too, she said softly, when I am ready, which may be sooner than either of us expected. Damien's answering smile was small, but it reached his eyes fully for the first time since Elena had first met him in his private study, weeks and a lifetime ago. In the weeks that followed, the palace slowly returned to a steadier rhythm. Lord Garrick Thorne's judgment was carried out according to the ancient laws of the Voss Pact, and the court, shaken by the revelation of betrayal within its own ranks, began the slow work of rebuilding trust in its own foundations. Lady Ashcroft, chastened by how thoroughly her assumptions about Elena's ambitions had been proven wrong, quietly withdrew her objections and, in time, became one of the more vocal supporters of the king's growing attachment to the young woman who had saved his son. Queen Mother Isolde spent long afternoons with Elena in the weeks that followed, sharing stories of her sister Marguerite, filling in the gaps of a family history Elena had never known she possessed, and slowly, carefully, the two women built a bond that neither had expected, but both had quietly needed. Kai continued to flourish, his laughter filling the nursery and, increasingly, the wider halls of the palace, as Elena's role within the household grew from caretaker into something the entire court had come to accept, and even celebrate, as inevitable. On a bright morning nearly 6 months after Kai had first called her name in the quiet nursery, Damien gathered the full court once more, this time for a celebration rather than a crisis, and stood before the assembled lords and ladies with Elena at his side and Kai between them, holding both of their hands. 18 months ago, this court grieved a loss that left my son silent, and my own heart nearly as quiet, Damien said, his voice carrying clearly through the great hall, where, months earlier, a small boy's honest declaration had first shaken this entire palace to its foundations. Today, I stand before you not only as your king, but as a father whose son laughs again, and as a man who has found, in the most unexpected of circumstances, a woman I intend to call my mate, and this court's future queen. He turned to Elena, his expression open and certain in a way the court had never once seen from their careful, guarded king, and Elena, her heart full to overflowing, answered him with a smile that needed no words at all. Beside them, Kai looked up at both of his parents with the wide, uncomplicated joy of a child who had simply always known, from the very first quiet afternoon in a sunlit nursery, exactly where he belonged, and exactly who belonged beside him. The court that had once held its breath in stunned silence at a single whispered word, now erupted into warm, genuine celebration, and Elena Whitmore, once a nameless kitchen servant with no family and no history, stood at the heart of it all, finally, completely, and forever, home.